Hello wrestling fans. Welcome back to the $80 million Pro Wrestle Machine studio and welcome back to the show. We are working our way through October 1997, certainly an interesting time in the history of professional wrestling. Before we start today, just a friendly reminder from the robot here, be kind to one another. Tell the people you love that you love them. Okay, here we go. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. October 13, 1997 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Life and Death of Brian Pillman. USWA and Michinoku Pro on the brink. Possible work UFC fight. First Hell in a Cell match, and more. By Observer staff. Even though this is the first thing you are reading, this is actually the last thing I'm writing. As you all know, a very good friend of mine passed away a few days ago. You all knew of him. Some of you knew him. This is not the first person that I've known fairly well in this business that died at a young age. Friend is a word that I'm not very liberal with, particularly when it comes to wrestling, because in many cases it depends on the last word you've written about someone. But it is one that I'd use in this instance without reservation. The shock that I personally felt when Vince McMahon went on the free-for-all segment with that cut-in was like a knife going through me. But the shock was nothing compared to the sadness when the reality set in the next day. The sadness is largely for those who loved him and needed him in their daily lives, and have to do without him. From a selfish standpoint, he was one of the funniest people I knew, and someone, almost no matter how bad his or my situation was, he would find a way to be both humorous and entertaining. We had a lot of strange similarities, particularly when it comes to sense of humor and being students of the wrestling business and the insanity that surrounds it. Yet in other ways we were complete opposites. His insanity reminded me of my high school days. We were at different ends of the business with different pressures. The business contributed to his craziness. Dealing with the craziness of this business forced me into the other direction. Whenever one of those weird things that somehow always happens in wrestling, and can only happen in wrestling, he'd say about how if we were in baseball, football, or basketball, that none of this could ever happen and we'd never have all these entertaining stories to joke about. There are a lot of people who knew him and were very sad this weekend that had to perform, and a lot of decisions that had to be made under a lot of pressure. If things seem strange or if people seem distracted while performing, I hope everyone understands. I expect there will be a lot of criticism of several people and decisions that were made, and under other circumstances I'd probably agree with a lot of them and can't say I disagree with them now. There will be a lot of people very critical of themselves and their own decisions. Usually in life, if you make a mistake, you have the chance to rectify it. But sometimes mistakes have absolute results that can't be rectified. Those are the ones hardest to deal with. I've been doing this for 15 years, and this was the hardest issue I've ever had to write. It would be convenient to label the death of Brian Pillman from an apparent heart attack at the age of 35 as another in the unfortunately long line of tragedies within the industry and then go on to the next chapter. The death, at first believed to be from an accidental overdose of prescription painkillers, was after further examination believed to be from a heart attack while he was sleeping, with a theory that the painkillers he had taken may have kept him from awakening, which resulted in him dying in his sleep. Medical examiners found heart damage, some of which was congenital. He had a family history of heart problems, including his father dying from a heart attack at the age of 50 when he was only 3 months old. Police Sergeant Jim Ryan said an overdose of the prescription drugs is one possibility as to the cause of the heart attack, but no official determination can be made until toxicology reports are completed, which was expected to be later in the week. It's a death, more than any other at least since the almost unavoidable Von Erich family tribulations, that is going to cause a lot of people to go through a lot of unpleasant introspection. There is the industry itself. After all, this isn't the first and won't be the last death of a young man leaving behind a family of young children. There is the World Wrestling Federation, the company that employed him, learning of the tragedy literally minutes before going on the air live, and a group of wrestlers and office personnel were forced to try to postpone their collective grief for a few hours and try put on an entertaining show with a happy face on. The death of any star wrestler is a tragedy. Finding out about it in regards to the timing only made a terrible situation that much worse. And there are his friends. Their grief itself had to be multiplied many times over because of feeling, whether justified or not, that this didn't really come out of the blue, and there were scary warning signs known best to those closest to him. It isn't as if any of his problems were ignored, or anyone attempted to have them swept under the rug because of his star status. There is a question that is bound to be asked, questioning how everything was handled based on the end result. Perhaps if the situation was handled perfectly, the end result could have been different, and perhaps, based on the cause of death, that isn't the case. It also could be easy and convenient to blame the industry and even the company, but it also wouldn't be fair. When Melanie Pillman stated on television that he gave his life for this profession, that would be a fair assessment. The reality is this isn't a movie, or a pro wrestling angle, or escapist entertainment, and there is simply no way to really know. And the situation is no less of a shock just because there were eerie premonitions by some close to him afraid of exactly what ended up taking place. Pillman was found at 1:09 p.m. Central Time on October 6, dead on his bed at the Budget Tell Motel in Bloomington, Minnesota. There were several bottles of pills, muscle relaxers, and painkillers, all prescription medication along with one empty beer bottle, all found near his body when the police opened the door to try and find him. Unlike in other similar situations where well-known wrestlers would clean up a victim's room before calling police to protect the business, nobody had seen Pillman since 10:45 p.m. the previous night, and the entire crew was already in St. Louis before anyone knew anything was amiss. There were no illegal drugs found in the room, and the bottles were not empty, nor was there a note, basically eliminating the possibility of it being a suicide. Even though Pillman had his own personal demons, those closest to him, remembering his reactions to a former girlfriend who was the biological mother of one of his children that later committed suicide, believed that the last thing he would ever do would do anything that would harm his children or their future. He had relied on painkillers heavily, particularly in the wake of his April 1996 Humvee wreck that destroyed his ankle and subsequent September 1996 reconstructive operation when the ankle failed to heal properly. While everyone in the industry knew about the severity of the injury, and it was apparent watching him wrestle on his recent comeback just how much it affected him athletically, Pillman really tried to hide from nearly everyone just how severe his daily pain was. The truth is, let alone compete at a high level athletically in pro wrestling, Pillman couldn't even play the field with his local softball team, the Loose Cannons, and would be in tremendous pain, which he'd largely keep to himself, just running the bases. This was a double frustration, because he prided himself on his athletic ability in the ring for most of his career, and he took his level of performance professionally as seriously as anyone in the profession. He was the prototypical student of pro wrestling. He liked to read whatever he could, and reacted passionately to it. He watched tapes of old-timers, and loved to talk with them to learn little forgotten tricks of the trade. When he first went heel, he wanted to see tapes of Buddy Rogers. He read, in fact, memorized the Luthez Booker Hooker in one weekend and went crazy trying to verify all the anecdotes, and went crazy when some of them turned out not to be historically accurate. When he and Steve Austin were put together as a tag team, he wanted to see tapes of Pat Patterson and Ray Stevens. Secondarily, and most importantly, he was in constant severe pain to the point just getting through airports was difficult, let alone the pain from wrestling, even though the promotion understood his limitations and kept his non-television matches short. He had wrestled the previous night at the St. Paul Civic Center and was scheduled for a major series of angles, continuing his saga with Goldust and Marlena on a pay-per-view that afternoon in St. Louis, and continuing at television tapings the next two nights. According to the story that ran nationally, ref Ed Sharkey at the matches in St. Paul noted that Pillman was sleeping on the floor in the dressing room during the card, which is very unusual, and said he had a real strange look to him. He had a few drinks after the matches with some of the wrestlers and was described as being tipsy when he declined invitations to go out with other wrestlers to dinner, and went back to his room at about 10:45 p.m. that night and left a message at home to his wife on his answering machine, which is the last anyone heard from him. The next afternoon, neither Pillman nor Bret Hart had arrived at the Kiel Center in St. Louis as of the mid-afternoon for the evening Bad Blood pay-per-view show. The feeling was they probably were going to take the last flight out of the Twin Cities, but when Bret arrived and Pillman wasn't with him, they became concerned since the show was scheduled to start in less than 2 hours. Pillman had missed two house shows in recent months, one of which was due to suffering an auto accident on the way to a show in early August. His behavior stemming from the painkillers had plenty of people in the company worried. When they called his house in St. Louis about 30 minutes before the free-for-all was to begin, his wife Melanie didn't know anything. Just minutes later, the police came to her door, and upon hearing the news she fainted. At about the same time, a WWF official called the hotel in Bloomington that he was staying at and was given the news that the police had come and found him dead in his room. He was in the middle of an angle that was taking advantage of his greatest strength as a performer, his acting ability and his ability to play as convincing a real life as opposed to a cartoon version of borderline psychotic, with Goldust and Marlena. It was an angle that after the two sets of tapings this week was to result in Marlena leaving Goldust for him. The angle appears to have been completely dropped, as the proposed renewing of the vows angle hype for weeks to take place at the Kansas City Raw taping was dropped without any sort of explanation, nor were the names Goldust nor Marlena ever mentioned during the show. Since coming up with his loose cannon character in late 1995, a character that made him the single most talked about performer in the industry in early 1996, it was a characterization that he took with him almost all the time. His lasting contribution to pro wrestling unfortunately was nothing short of changing the industry in many ways, with his angle that blurred the line between work and shoot to the point that not only did the wrestlers have no idea where the work ended, but even the scattered few in on the angle from the start that thought they knew really didn't. If anything, the bizarre interplay the next night in Kansas City between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, and the interview that Ric Flair did on Nitro in Minneapolis, were the most fitting tributes to him, even though that was hardly the idea in either case. It's not unfortunate because of the evolutionary path the angle, and the influence of ECW and Japan shoot angles, have taken the industry, but unfortunate because if there is a lasting contribution Pillman has made to pro wrestling, it should be, as in other similar situations, in the lessons learned from his death. There is the simple version of that lesson, and the more complicated one. The simple version is that the problem with pain pills, despite how comedic or entertaining some might find people's behavior when loaded, is no laughing matter. Mixing somas with alcohol, which is a part of day-to-day living for so many in the industry on almost a daily basis, can be a Russian roulette cocktail. The more complicated version is real life. Being passive in this situation is easier than being confrontational, but it enables the situation to continue. And when it comes to these problems, confrontational usually doesn't work either. It isn't as if internally within the business the problems are a secret, or the potential end result and repercussions to them wasn't perhaps the single greatest fear of those in charge of the respective companies. So live, on a pay-per-view, Vince McMahon had to go on with the show moments after one of his greatest fears had become reality. A major star dying on his watch, so to speak, possibly from drugs. After the scare on the airplane where Road Warrior Hawk passed out, combined with the warning article at about the same time in these pages, there was no secret within the WWF that something could happen, and wrestlers were told that drug tests would be re-implemented based on suspicion. McMahon taped a short cut in which aired during the pregame show, and a few times during the broadcast, mentioned the death again, in most somber tones. He brought up, which was the presumption at the time, it was from an overdose. As the owner of a company that has had a long and storied history of drug problems and repercussions, had to be as great a living nightmare as could be possible, and it was almost as if while talking about abuse of drugs being a problem in both sports and entertainment, he was asking for mercy himself. Whatever nightmare he and the company was going through while trying to entertain an audience was minuscule compared to the nightmare of the family left behind. He had a family with 5 children, with another on the way, which, making the tragedy even more pronounced, his wife found out just a few days before his death and had yet to tell him about. His wife Melanie had 2 daughters from a prior marriage, he had 2 daughters from previous relationships, and they had a 4-year-old son named Brian, with a knack for jumping off tables and counters and telling people, "Look, I'm flying Brian." Pillman had an 8-year-old daughter named Brittany from a previous relationship whose mother, his girlfriend from years back, had killed herself 2 years earlier. She was just beginning to recover from that shock when she learned about her father dying, and she let out a horrific scream for 15 minutes straight like a wounded animal. Pillman took his ex-girlfriend's suicide very hard. After a life destroyed from drug problems herself, it appeared she wanted to shoot herself in the head while on the phone with him for the most dramatic ending. Unfortunately, Pillman was on the road when she decided to make her grand exit, and after a lengthy conversation with Melanie, trying to counsel her out of it, she then called up her mother, who Pillman thought the world of, and while on the phone with her, blew her brains out. Whether rightly or wrongly, many close to her blamed her downfall on losing a very bitter child custody fight with Brian over Brittany, a fight that left everyone involved with very bitter internal scars. Her family's reaction after the death to Pillman was yet another in a very long line of internal hardships life dealt him. That was just another of what in many ways was a lifetime of tragedies, defying odds, athletic accomplishments, wild times, and occasional lunacy that told the story of his life. Brian Pillman was born May 22, 1962, growing up in Norwood, Ohio, a working-class suburb of Cincinnati, where the Cincinnati Gardens is located. He was raised mainly by his mother since his father died fairly young, who worked as a waitress. He was born with throat cancer and underwent 31 different operations before the age of 3, leaving him with a raspy voice that he was teased about incessantly in childhood. The voice became his trademark when he began to make his mark in pro wrestling. He wound up being a local high school football hero, but because of his size, wasn't thought to have any potential to play in college. He went to Miami of Ohio as a walk-on, and not only made the team, but wound up by his senior year in 1983 as a second-team All-American nose guard. As a 5'9" defensive lineman, a combination of weight training and heavy use of steroids bulked him up to nearly 250 pounds, and he was bench pressing close to 450 and squatting more than 600 pounds. Still, there wasn't much demand in the NFL for 5'9" defensive linemen, and he went undrafted. He went to the Cincinnati Bengals as a free agent, and made the team in 1984, being converted to linebacker but mainly playing on the special teams. Although he was not a star, he had a lot of local popularity for being a local product who defied the odds and gained a reputation for being one of the physically and mentally toughest players on the team. As a rookie, he was voted the winner of the Ed Block Courage Award. He ended up being traded to the Buffalo Bills prior to the 1985 season, but was cut in training camp. Although Pillman himself may have never been aware of this, the Bills staff had already decided Pillman made the team. But shortly before the final cuts, an assistant coach found his steroids at camp and the team realized he was a little guy all juiced up, and during the final cut it was enough to sway the decision. He wound up signing with the Calgary Stampeders of the Canadian Football League in 1986, and after playing the first 3 games of the season broke his ankle, the same ankle that eventually was destroyed in the Humvee wreck, which ended his football career. Kim Wood, who was and still is the strength coach with the Bengals and has had a long-time knowledge of the inner working of pro wrestling, recommended to Pillman, who had watched some of the Sheik's pro wrestling as a kid in Cincinnati, that he hook up with the Hart family and try to break into pro wrestling. After making contact, Bruce Hart, the Stampede wrestling booker, Hart used Pillman's stature as a former Stampede, however limited his actual tenure with the team was because of his wild personality at the time. He was very popular with most of the players, to jumpstart his pro wrestling training and rush him into the ring. It wasn't long before he was an instructor rather than a student at the camp. He started his career with Stampede Wrestling after doing an angle the previous week, in the main event of a November 5, 1986 show at the Calgary Stampede Pavilion. With numerous Stampeders in the babyface corner rooting him on, Pillman teamed with Owen and Keith Hart to beat Mokan Singh and Great Gama and Vladimir Krupov. At the time, Stampede Wrestling was developing some of what would turn out to be the biggest stars in the world, including the likes of Owen Hart, Chris Benoit, Jushin Liger and Hiroshi Hase. Another almost unknown piece of wrestling trivia was that during his early Stampede stay, an angle was done where heels attacked his supposed sister Teresa to build to a big match the next week. Teresa, real name Teresa Hayes, resurfaced many years later as ECW's Beulah McGillicuddy. Bruce Hart and Pillman as the tag team called Bad Company, clad in sunglasses and leather jackets in the final and most memorable run of Bruce's career, were the territory's top babyface tag team for most of the next 2 years. He was the 1987 Rookie of the Year in the Wrestling Observer poll. He survived the craziness of Calgary wrestling, including suffering a severe shoulder injury that nearly ended his career, and a tricep tear in a backstage fight where he was ambushed by a much larger Brick Bronski, then after being knocked to the deck, got up and tore him to shreds. Although he remained good friends with Bruce and Owen Hart, that fight was a wake-up call to him that it was time to leave Stampede Wrestling. Largely through making a contact with Jim Ross, he was brought into World Championship Wrestling in the spring of 1989. He was supposed to start a few months earlier, with the original idea for him to be a heel managed by Paul E. Dangerously and team with Dennis Condrey as a new version of the Midnight Express. However, his job was nixed when new booker George Scott didn't want to bring in a wrestler that he had never heard of. Shortly after Scott was let go, Pillman's name resurfaced and he was brought in as a babyface with numerous musical videos. Pillman wrestled several television dark matches, but was very nervous and didn't perform well, and gained a reputation immediately for being far more green and inexperienced than he really was. But it probably worked in his favor, because once the butterflies wore off and he got his confidence back up, he started having good matches, and the belief was that he was improving at an amazing rate. His first major match with the company would have been at the 1989 Halloween Havoc pay-per-view show from Philadelphia, where he had one of the best matches on the card, more impressive since it was with Lex Luger, which surprised most since the feeling going into the match was that Luger was going to have a hard time carrying Pillman in his first major match. Pillman's 7-year WCW tenure, largely as a mid-card babyface who was generally considered among the best athletic workers in the company, saw several different rebirths. He was Flying Brian, the heartthrob pretty boy babyface with Tom Zenk, a role he was never comfortable with. He was the personal protege of Ric Flair, including a famous match on WCW Saturday Night that drew what is still to this day the largest audience ever to watch that program in early 1990. He was the high-flying light heavyweight champion, having the best matches in the country against Jushin Liger, highlighted by a Christmas week house show run in 1991, and a Match of the Year candidate on the February 29, 1992 Super Brawl pay-per-view show in Milwaukee. Based on the Liger matches and his performances as champion, he signed a 3-year $225,000 per base with numerous incentive bonuses contract with Kip Frey, who was at the time running WCW. When Bill Watts came aboard, Pillman's contract, unusually high for his position given the industry standards at that time, particularly as a light heavyweight, caused an immediate dispute. Just before that time, Pillman's potential really began to show for the first time as he turned heel. which was his true calling. Watts gave Pillman an ultimatum: either re-sign a lower-priced contract, or be jobbed out. Pillman refused. After a short period of being jobbed in the opener nearly every night despite being among the company's hottest workers at the time, with lots of internal pressure on him to cave in to Watts, he stood firm, claiming he was going to become the highest-paid opening match jobber in pro wrestling history until the situation of his jobbing and the reasons for it became an embarrassment for the company, and both sides settled their problems in a solution that was largely face-saving for both sides. In the wake of all the problems, Watts decided to drop the light heavyweight division. Pillman's career was back in limbo until he was put together as the Hollywood Blondes tag team with Steve Austin in 1993. Ironically, Austin complained against the idea at the time, not wanting to be a tag team wrestler, but the two ended up becoming good friends and even better partners, and were voted in the Observer poll Tag Team of the Year for that year. At the time, people thought they could become the great tag team of this decade. The two captured the WCW tag belts from Ricky Steamboat and Shane Douglas on March 3, 1993 in Macon, Georgia. However, business went into the toilet during that summer, and when Ric Flair was signed back into WCW after leaving the WWF, a feud was put together with Pillman and Austin as the obnoxious young heels against Flair and Arn Anderson, building up to Flair's first match in WCW on a Clash of the Champions. When that clash drew only a 2.6 rating, still the lowest clash rating in history, the booking committee put the blame on Pillman and Austin being a failure as a heel team, a conclusion that almost nobody watching at the time would agree with, and broke them up, with Pillman being put back in a babyface role sans any push. By this point, Pillman suffered a serious back injury and did very little wrestling for months. Outside the ring, his personal life, which he largely kept quiet about, had major ups and downs. He had a reputation, well deserved, of being a wildman with an apparently endless supply of beautiful women. He had one girlfriend of many years, Rochelle, who he knew from Cincinnati and lived with in Atlanta, who was viciously stabbed in a break-in while he was on the road. Their breakup years later wound up in one tragedy after another. The two of them had a daughter, and he also had another daughter from another woman. Rochelle developed a major drug problem, and Pillman was far from perfect himself, which turned into a child custody battle that turned his and his new family's life into a one-year-long nightmare. By this time, Pillman had married a former Penthouse pet, Melanie, who ironically had her own background around wrestling as being the one-time girlfriend in a stormy relationship with Jim Hellwig when he was riding high as one of the two biggest stars in the WWF. After a whirlwind romance, Pillman proposed to her at the Grand Canyon. It was typical Pillman apparent insanity, as he saw her photo in a magazine and immediately decided this was the woman he was going to marry. In 1993, in the middle of the child custody fight, Rochelle was supposed to pick up Brittany and never showed up. She had disappeared, and nobody, not her family nor friends, could find her. While this was going on, Pillman was literally scared to death, feeling he was about to become the white OJ, as he became the obvious lead suspect. Pillman, drinking heavily based on fear he was about to be arrested for something he didn't do, decided to play amateur detective to clear himself and went traveling in the worst section of Cincinnati, carrying a photo of her and talking to the corner drug dealers. While he was there, the police were riding by and saw a fairly well-known local celebrity hanging with drug dealers in the worst part of town. They thought he had swallowed something and arrested him. As it turned out, he had 1 or 2 painkillers, without carrying the prescription, on him. He ended up plea bargaining down to a drunk driving offense once he proved he had a prescription for the pills on him and no other drugs were found. He was still under suspicion in his girlfriend's disappearance until a few weeks later she was found in Florida, totally messed up, when the car she and a few men she was with was pulled over. In late 1995, knowing his contract had only a few months remaining and with him still not receiving much of a push and fear, which was totally well-founded at the time, that his high price tag would be cut, he decided to take his career into his own hands. In Wood's kitchen, the two devised one of more unique approaches in wrestling history, largely as an attempt to emulate the late Bruiser Brody and make his own break into superstardom. He became, both in the ring and often out of the ring as well, the loose cannon. Someone who could and would do anything at any given time. He became a reactionary right-winger on a Cincinnati radio station to get the gimmick over. He continually would do things and say things on Live Nitro to seemingly put his position in jeopardy, and his behavior outside the ring around the wrestlers was all part of his work in convincing everyone that he had lost his mind. He had seriously talked with friends, most notably Terry Funk, who became something of a secret mentor to him, about doing a publicity stunt where he'd run on the field, chain himself to the goalposts during the 1996 Super Bowl game. Within the company, only Eric Bischoff and Kevin Sullivan were aware that what he was doing on Nitro and outside the ring with the boys was a work, which is why he stayed on television even though Bischoff continually threatened to both publicly and privately say he was on loose ice and on the verge of being fired. The work continued to the point that Pillman had an on-air confrontation with Sullivan, the booker, which they worked to look like a match had gotten out of control. The angle was so well done that people believed Sullivan was attempting to rip out Pillman's eye in a fake shoot angle. However, Sullivan blew the credibility of the shoot part of the angle, much to Pillman's chagrin, who wanted to fool everyone all the time, the next week on television by using the incident as part of his interview to build up a rematch on a pay-per-view. So Pillman took his fantasy reality one step farther, in what was billed as a respect match on February 11, 1996 in St. Petersburg, where the loser would have to say he respected the winner, against Sullivan. Pillman took a few shots, sarcastically said the famous line, "I respect you, Booker man," and walked out of the ring, out of the building and out of the promotion. But where Bischoff and Sullivan, who thought they devised the angle with Pillman, thought the angle ended, it really had only begun. Pillman had talked them into actually firing him to work everyone in the company and the business, getting TBS to send out the termination notice and everything. At the same time, they had worked out a deal with ECW, which was supposed to be the renegade independent group, to slide Pillman over. Pillman largely worked out the deal himself with Paul Heyman, and WCW approved it, and his appearing on ECW would theoretically give credibility to the fact Pillman really was fired from WCW for whenever his surprise return would take place. Although he never wrestled one match for ECW, nearly every angle and video he did during his brief tenure was memorable. At the same time, Pillman had to undergo another throat operation which would keep him out of action a few weeks. Desperate for ratings in the Monday Night War, WCW ordered Pillman to show up in the audience just a few weeks later, and Hulk Hogan, seeing the pop Pillman got, attempted to get Pillman booked onto the heel team in an infamous 2-on-8 match on the uncensored pay-per-view show on March 24, 1996 in Tupelo, Mississippi. Due to Pillman's throat surgery, his doctor sent a note to WCW saying that he couldn't perform that soon. Pillman probably shouldn't have wrestled, but under normal circumstances, he probably would have, balking more because his not-so-amazing clairvoyant powers told him the match, which included Tom Zeus Lister as Z Gangsta and the late Jeep Swenson, would near the top of every list of the worst matches in the history of the industry, and he didn't want to be a part of it. WCW continued to advertise Pillman and pressure him to perform, and even during the pregame show were saying he was going to be there even though he had firmly told them several days earlier he wouldn't. Pillman was technically fired from WCW, worked firing with only Sullivan and Bischoff in on it, although by this time the fact it had almost all been an angle. About the only memorable thing during that run that was truly a shoot was when Pillman was grabbing Bobby Heenan during a clash match against Eddie Guerrero, and Heenan freaked out because he was afraid Pillman was going to accidentally hurt his bad neck, swore on the air and walked off. Was pretty well established. This made him the most talked about wrestler on the inside of the business and a free agent at the same time. He began negotiating with Vince McMahon, who initially was leery of dealing with him because Pillman, acting completely out of his mind, approached McMahon at the NAPI convention in Las Vegas. After assuring McMahon that everything he'd done was a work, and after Ross and Jim Cornette went to bat for Pillman since McMahon and everyone in wrestling had reservations about him because he was living his gimmick to a scary degree, McMahon decided to start serious negotiations. The original plan was to use the WWF, which at the time wasn't offering guaranteed money, to up his price to Bischoff, figuring Bischoff and Sullivan didn't want to lose the character they helped create. At the same time, there was the consideration, with him just weeks away from his 34th birthday, that this next contract signing would be the prime years of his career for business, and he knew the top of the mountain at WCW was blocked with the Hogan Clique, and with Kevin Nash and Scott Hall arriving, while the field in WWF was more wide open. The basic WCW plan was for him to form his own Four Horsemen with Chris Benoit and two others, and feud with Flair and Anderson once again. It was a good spot, but at that point, he was looking for a shot at the top spot. With the babyface Shawn Michaels being groomed to be the long-term WWF champion, size wasn't going to be a major issue in being the top heel in that company. McMahon offered a guaranteed deal, believed to be only the third or fourth time in history he'd done such a thing, although it's soon become commonplace given the realities of the wrestling war, which caused Bischoff, who had lowballed earlier negotiations, to up his offer to the $400,000 range. While Pillman was in the catbird seat, just a few days from becoming a real-life hot commodity free agent in the midst of a competitive Monday Night Wrestling war, he was still going out of his mind, staying up all night, calling everyone and doing everything at all hours trying to get advice on how to play the game to make the most money. Soon after purchasing a Humvee, he apparently fell asleep at the wheel on April 15th, went off the road, and got thrown 40 feet into a field where he was lying in a pool of his own blood. His face was so swollen that his friends who visited him in the hospital really couldn't even recognize him. By the end of the week, after surgery which included taking bone from his hip to reconstruct his ankle, he was released from the hospital. Since Pillman had been orchestrating works on the entire world to keep himself the most talked about name inside the industry, many within wrestling thought this was simply the latest chapter of a bizarre work. But this was real. Even though the future of his career in the ring looked questionable, neither Bischoff nor McMahon let up on the offer. Pillman claimed he'd been told he'd recover 100% from the injuries in a few months, although secretly he feared the worst. Eventually Pillman chose McMahon's offer largely because internally he thought there was no choice in the matter since Bischoff wouldn't eliminate the 90-day termination cycles from the contract, and Pillman, fearing the possibility of not being able to return to the ring, didn't want to risk his family's future on what was he believed could have turned into a short-term deal. WWF tried to make a big deal of Pillman's signing, rushing him onto television in a failed attempt to close the ratings gap. Although months from being able to wrestle, Pillman was running around the country constantly on airplanes trying to keep his gimmick strong while being unable to wrestle. Doing so caused his ankle to not heal properly, and a few months later they had to re-break the ankle, do another reconstructive surgery, and start the procedure from scratch, with the end result being an ankle fused into a walking position. WWF created an angle with its top heel at the time, Steve Austin, which positioned Pillman as strongly as possible to explain the injury and an absence while he truly rested and recovered this time, for his return. Just a few days after surgery, in a controversial desperate attempt to establish a new Raw time slot, the WWF did the infamous gun angle where Austin broke into Pillman's house where Pillman was with his bereaved wife, was held off by a shotgun, and the satellite lost transmission as they teased that shots had been fired. Pillman was largely kept home for the next several months until resurfacing doing the announcing on Shotgun to build for his in-ring return after WrestleMania. His return as an active competitor is probably going to be the most criticized and second-guessed decision, hindsight being 2020, stemming from this entire situation. Hindsight being 2020, his death unfortunately may not have been a freak occurrence, but as a simple end result to an emotional mathematical problem, just as 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 = 5. You had a person who spent his life doing things athletically people told him he couldn't do. He did them not only to stick it to those who doubted him, but to prove things to his toughest critic of all himself. Although he did defy the odds and numerous medical authorities by even coming back, and his acting ability was likely to keep him in the forefront as a star for years, his physical limitations had to be mentally driving him crazy and the constant pain didn't help. Everyone goes through bad periods in life that leave certain scars, and he went through far more than most people and the scars were very deep. The fact he couldn't perform physically up to the level he could mentally, because he literally lived for nothing but his family and the wrestling business, took its toll on him. The fact was, unlike many who seemed to take advantage of injuries while on a guaranteed contract, Pillman had guilt feelings that he wasn't earning his money during the entire period he was out and felt he had to do whatever the company wanted to feel in his own mind that he was earning his big contract. WWF officials and some of his business associates were extremely worried about his behavior. Wrestlers who liked him were afraid to travel with him. There was an argument while he was on an airplane telephone where he was shouting and cursing loudly out of control, which further fueled the worrying of both WWF road agents and other wrestlers. About 5 weeks before his death, Ross, who had remained close friends with him and had been counseling him several times per week regarding his problems, ordered him to undergo a drug test. He was furious about being singled out, since he had never gone on television so loaded he couldn't perform in or out of the ring as it is believed another top star had done 1 or 2 times in the recent weeks. Melanie was also worried about the level of pain medication he'd been taking and her own knowledge of being close to and around wrestlers on and off for 10 years that the wrestlers shared their prescription drugs back and forth and wanted him to undergo rehab, but he had a saying that he even wore on a t-shirt that rehab was for losers. He refused and blamed being singled out to take the drug test on wreaking havoc with his marriage, and felt that when a wrestling company affects his marriage that he had to get out of the wrestling company. He requested a release from the WWF, feeling he could go back to WCW and slide back into the final slot in the Four Horsemen. His personal situation was rocky for a short period of time, which included him violating a restraining order and Melanie filing for a divorce. After a brief separation, he had returned home. He was pulled from the October 3rd house show in Winnipeg and from all Friday night house shows for the next few weeks because of a court-mandated anger management class he had to take for violating the restraining order for 4 straight Saturday mornings, and went back on the road after the class for the matches in St. Paul for the final match of his career against Goldust. The drug test came back a few weeks ago showing nothing in his system except for the prescription pain medication it was well known he was using, and also showed a small amount of DECA Durabolin, an anabolic steroid that was very popular among bodybuilders and wrestlers in the 80s. Decadurabolin can stay in the system literally for several months, and there have been medical cases of it showing up on a drug test even 1 year after use had stopped, although cases like that are extremely rare. Pillman had apparently used it as almost a desperate attempt to speed up the healing process for his ankle before his return to the ring. Because it was a small amount and the drug has such a long half-life in the system, he wasn't suspended. Pillman had suffered internal side effects many years ago from his steroid use from football and early in his wrestling career, not to mention suffering many muscle pulls and tears which he attributed to his use. This caused him to get off the drugs before it became a major issue in the industry, and actually he was fairly vocal about their potential problems and the effect they were having on the wrestling business. In fact, when Frey started doing anti-steroid public service announcements when the industry was under the steroid cloud, Pillman was the first to go on television, admit to use and warn others against it. The pay-per-view show went on, although not as scheduled. About 25 to 30 minutes of the show had been blocked off for Pillman matches with Dude Love and Goldust. With very little warning, the Mexican minis were rushed onto the show and did not have a good match. With the show running way short, an 8-man tag was added, again with very little notice. It was a show that was under a dark cloud from the beginning, and the matches certainly reflected that. And then, seemingly oblivious to everything that had gone on, Shawn Michaels and Undertaker put on one of the greatest cage matches in the history of wrestling to save the show. The next night, both WCW and WWF opened their Monday Night Live shows with mentions of Pillman's death. WCW had a brief graphic and it was never mentioned the rest of the show. WWF opened the show with virtually all the wrestlers in attendance coming out for a 10-bell salute. During the show they constantly promoted an interview with Melanie Pillman, live from the family home in Walton, Kentucky. During the show they showed large framed photos in the family den, a photo of Brian holding his baby son, a photo of Brian and Melanie together, and a photo of Pillman and Austin as WCW Tag Team Champions as teases to build to Melanie's interview. Melanie Pillman had reservations about going on live, but eventually consented due to her own loyalty to the company that employed her husband. The only thing I'd like to say in defense of everyone involved is that under the emotional state everyone was under, it would be cruel and heartless to be critical of the segment because it wasn't smooth-flowing, perfect television. But the segment left a lot of people very uneasy for many different reasons, not the least of which were all the teases and holding it off until late that made it come across as a way to build up ratings. She had a very heartfelt message, a warning from mainly those within the industry as to not let her husband's death, and for that matter similar deaths within the profession, be in vain, and use this as a lesson to be learned from everyone. She wanted her husband to best be remembered as the greatest father in the world and as a warm and compassionate person. We all knew abuse of painkillers among some wrestlers is out of control, and the stories of erratic behavior that some find funny just aren't very funny today. It is impossible to have pro wrestling, or for that matter pro football, pro basketball, or anything of the type as we know it today without some form of painkillers. But there comes a line that everyone has to draw, and that's when the painkillers take over the body and simply aren't medication to heal the body. This was going to happen to someone in the business, and whomever it would be, the odds were that it would be somebody's husband and somebody's father. As it turned out, it was Melanie Pillman's husband and the father of their 5, soon to be 6, children. And to them, to his friends, the story doesn't end this week as the rest of the industry goes on to its next chapter. Mark Madden of WCW, who had known Pillman for many years, wrote an article for the WCW website and asked if we could have it printed here. I never imagined anything written by Mark Madden at this point to be in the Observer, but it is a great piece. It's 1 o'clock in the morning, and I'm waiting for a phone call. It's a phone call that's never, ever going to come. It's from my friend Brian. You knew him as Flying Brian, as the Loose Cannon, as the Ticking Time Bomb, as one half of the Hollywood Blondes, as a member of the Hart Foundation, as a member of the Four Horsemen, as the Rouge Horsemen, as one half of Bad Company, as Brian F. and Pillman. But to me he was just Brian. He drove me absolutely, totally insane. I never knew when I was going to hear from him. Sometimes he wouldn't call for weeks. Sometimes he'd call 5 times in one day. He'd usually call me at home, but sometimes at work. Once he called me when I was on my radio sports talk show, and got on the air. Thank God for 7-second delay. Hey, you know what he was like. Brian was a good friend. Not many give a damn about friendship these days. Most see friendship as a means to a self-serving end. But Brian valued friendship, and so do I. And now I sit by the phone, waiting for a call that will never come. Because it's the only way I can make myself feel like he's still around. Those most affected by Brian's death are his wife, Melanie, and their 5 children. But anyone who knew him was touched by him. Wrestling is a backstabbing kind of business on a good day. But I don't know anyone that disliked Brian. He got along with wrestlers in both major companies, with management in both major companies. He was a great guy, a great husband, a great father, a great friend, and a great performer. Brian loved wrestling. He had an old school style respect for the business but a 90s sensibilities about what would work. I believe he would have wound up running one of the major companies someday. Brian wrestled in WCW from 1989 to 1996. He had two hot runs. The first was in 1993, when he partnered with Steve Austin as the Hollywood Blondes. By my reckoning, they were the best tag team of the 90s. Brian shed his pretty boy babyface image to become a sadistic, psychopathic heel. He was as easy to hate in the ring as he was to like outside it. He got toured again in 1995, when he was a member of the Four Horsemen. That was an exciting time for him. He really looked up to Flair, fashioned his persona after both Flair and Terry Funk. To team with Flair was like a dream come true. In 1996, he had a pseudo-shoot feud with Booker man Kevin Sullivan. It had everyone in wrestling, from the boys to casual fans to dirt sheet readers, wondering if it was legit or if it was pro wrestling. It was easy to wonder that about Brian himself. In the ring, he was half crazed. Away from it, he was sometimes totally crazed. He could even be scary. But just when you thought he was about to go completely off the edge, he'd smile and say, "It's all a work, you know," and then laugh. Brian was in a bad wreck in April 1996. He flipped his Humvee, mangling one of his ankles. The ankle was eventually fused into a walking position. He never regained his mobility. It frustrated him. By the time he recovered and started with the World Wrestling Federation, he had his character down pat. His interviews were so strong, his psychology was so good, that he didn't even have to wrestle at all to get over. And when he did wrestle, he was fine. It hurt, but he did well. Brian would have been an all-time great. He was like Terry Funk on acid, and that was without doing acid. And now he's gone. Wrestling makes strange friendships, and there haven't been many stranger than ours. A wrestling star and dirt sheet alumnus. An ex-NFL player married to a penthouse pet and an overweight sports writer. Now that I've worked for WCW for 4 years, it's kind of fashionable to be my buddy. But when I wrote for the dirt sheets, even though I talked to a lot of wrestlers, very few would acknowledge me in front of other wrestles. Kayfabe, you know. But Brian would introduce me to other guys, as only he could. "Hey, do you know Mark Madden?" "No." "Well, you should, because he buried you in the pro wrestling torch this week." "Thanks." "I have some regrets. I regret that I never tried very hard to help him curb his inner demons. For the rest of my life, I'll wonder if Brian might still be with us if someone had gone the extra mile to help him. I doubt it, because there was no telling Brian what to do. I regret we didn't spend much time together in person, although we did talk on the phone constantly. By the time I started going on the road to work at WCW, he was already in the WWF. But the regrets are few, and the memories are many. Brian often called late at night, 1, 2, or 3 in the morning. He always had a crazy plan, a way to get over, a way to make money, a way for us to work together. He made me laugh. I trusted him. His friendship meant a lot to me. I hope he knew that. I've shed a few tears over this, but I found a way to beat that. Every time I feel like crying, I think of Brian laughing his maniacal laugh, of him talking about Melanie and his kids, of him trying to work me during his feud with Kevin Sullivan, of one of his schemes and plots, or anecdotes, or one of his booking ideas, of his advice to long-suffering WCW wrestler Joey Maggs, of his dealings with his seemingly luckless lawyer Elliot Pollock. It was a pleasure knowing Brian. He was a lot of fun. I miss him. I think I'm going to bed. It's 2 a.m. The phone isn't going to ring. No thought and no memory can stop the tears from flowing now. Goodbye, Brian. Brian Pillman career title history. WCW World Tag Team with Steve Austin defeated Ricky Steamboat and Shane Douglas March 3, 1993 in Macon, Georgia. Lost to Arn Anderson and Paul Roma August 18, 1983 in Daytona Beach, Florida. Pillman didn't wrestle match due to an injury, but since syndication tapings were done in advance, a title change needed to occur, so Steven Regal teamed with Austin in title match. WCW US Tag Team with Tom Zenk defeated Michael Hayes and Jim Garvin in finals of tourney for vacant titles December 12, 1990 in Gainesville, Georgia. Lost to Bobby Eaton and Stan Lane May 19, 1990 in Washington, D.C. WCW Light Heavyweight defeated Ricky Morton in tournament finals to become first champion October 27, 1991 in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Lost to Jushin Liger December 25, 1991 in Atlanta. Defeated Liger February 29, 1991 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Lost to Scotty Flamingo Raven June 20, 1992 in Mobile, Alabama. International Tag Team, Stampede, with Bruce Hart defeated Cuban Assassin Angel Acevedo and Ron Starr in tournament finals for vacant titles April 6, 1987 in Calgary. Lost to Makan Singh and Jerry Morrow November 11, 1987 in Great Falls, Montana. Defeated Singh and Morrow November 13, 1987 in Calgary. Lost to Assassin and Morrow July 22, 1988 in Calgary. Just 6 days before its biggest show of the year, the Michinoku Pro Wrestling office in Japan announced that they would be suspending operations effective early next year. Great Sasuke, Masanori Murakawa, held a press conference in Tokyo on October 4th and announced that the company, which has been operating heavily in the red, would suspend operations in January. At the same time, Sasuke said that he would be undergoing reconstructive surgery on his right knee, which would keep him out of action for most of 1988. The belief is that Sasuke would restart the promotion when he's able to return to the ring. In the interim, the heel group within the promotion called Kaientai DX, led by Dick Togo, would probably promote some of their own shows, while wrestlers like Grant Hamada and Tiger Mask would wrestle full-time in Mexico. Michinoku Pro Wrestling was formed in 1993 as a regional promotion in the northeast part of Japan based in Aomori. Their trademark was running small school shows in gyms, usually before 200 to 400 fans, with fans sitting on the floor rather than in chairs enjoying the lucha libre style action. Sasuke put the company on the map largely through a promotional affiliation with New Japan, an affiliation that fell apart when Sasuke started negotiating this year with the WWF. Those dealings largely fell through with the exception of the end result of Taka Michinoku joining the WWF. The group has a major show on October 10th at Sumo Hall in Tokyo with a double main event: Sasuke vs. Michinoku in a street fight and Undertaker vs. Jinsei Shinzaki. The latest on the trials and tribulations from what was once the United States Wrestling Association saw cancellation of its flagship wrestling show and the opening of a new promotion in its territory. WMC TV in Memphis, the local NBC affiliate, which had run pro wrestling since 1977, announced this past week that its final wrestling television show would be on October 4th. The decision, which came to no surprise to anyone following the story, made by WMC General Manager Mason Granger, was based on a lawsuit for control of USWA that wasn't going to be settled, and until it was, the company was largely no longer in operation. The USWA canceled all its house shows this week and there are no more cards scheduled. The final television show was another highlight show, although the highlights were more current than in the previous 2 weeks. Also on October 4th, Bert Prentice, who had run opposition to USWA for several years before joining the group just prior to it falling apart, opened up a new promotion with a show in Lebanon, Tennessee before about 200 fans, using Wolfie D vs. Billy Travis as the main event. The show was a television taping, using mostly the same wrestlers Prentice used in his old North American All-Star Wrestling office, some of which aren't doing this group and are instead working for yet another rival group run by former Prentice wrestler Farron Fox. The big news with the new promotion, called Music City Wrestling, is the surprising involvement of Jerry Jarrett. Jarrett is providing some funding for the group and is trying to downplay his involvement with the group, although has admitted to an involvement, which will be largely run by Prentice. The belief is that this group will wind up taking over the USWA syndication network due to the fact USWA isn't providing any new programming and the contract with the syndicator and the station only allows for 2 highlight shows per year, a quota of which they top with a 3rd highlight show this past week. In addition, with the WMC cancellation, it is questionable if USWA will even tape new highlight shows. The biggest behind-the-scenes controversy in the history of the Ultimate Fighting Championship unfolded with the claim by Mark Hall that he threw his fight, a 1996 Ultimate to eventual tournament winner Don Frye. The strange scenario of the fight on December 7th in Birmingham, Alabama had been a subject of discussion by many since it had taken place. Frye, coming off a grueling victory over Gary Goodridge in the first round, fought Hall, a stablemate, who replaced an exhausted and dehydrated Chemo, who had to drop out after his first round win over Paul Verlins. Hall impressively won an alternate match against Felix Lee Mitchell. Frye and Hall had 2 previous matches, with Frye winning both times, once in a UFC and the other in Japan. Frye won the 3rd fight, the one in question, in 20 seconds with an ankle lock. In the December 16/96 issue of The Observer, the suspicions were noted as it read, between Fry's post-match interview where he praised Hall as one of the greatest fighters in the world, the ease of the victory at a time where Fry badly needed to conserve energy, the fact that both men have the same business manager, and the fact that Hall's first match corner woman, Becky Levy, was in this match Fry's corner woman, brought out a major air of suspicion in some circles with this match and finish. Despite the suspicion, the reality was that it wasn't suspicious in the least, and Hall actually tapped too late and Fry did some serious damage to Hall's ankle with the finisher. From being there, and just a few feet away while all this was going on, my immediate reaction to the finish is that it was a work. Same business manager. Such an easy fight when Fry was clearly exhausted. The strange post-match interview. My opinion changed viewing the reaction largely of Hall's fiancée, who, unless she was a top-flight actress, couldn't have pulled off her reactions of concern at Hall's apparent injury so convincingly. The suspicion from a major pro wrestling type was that they simply were working the fiancé as well. Hall was limping for the rest of the night. Still, there had been behind-the-scenes suspicions of the fight, which may have been among the reasons Hall, like Anthony Macias, who lost a suspicious, but in a totally different way, match to Oleg Toktarov in 1995, had never been invited back to a UFC. Since the match, both have become involved in pro wrestling, Fry as a Big Show regular with New Japan, and Hall working one show with Kingdom. The story resurfaced after Hall did an interview in Brazil on September 14 stating that at the Vale Tudo tournament he had done that night, losing in the semifinals, all the matches were real and that someday the truth would come out about his match with Fry. Fry responded by threatening Hall with a lawsuit and also challenging him to a $10,000 winner-take-all match to prove he didn't need to fix a match to beat him. In response to that, Hall wrote a letter which was posted on the internet on October 1st, written almost like a pro wrestling interview. He claimed Fry came into his dressing room and begged him to throw the match. Hall claimed that both his fiancée and two of his students heard the conversation, and that Fry sounded nervous and desperate, trying to talk low to conceal the conversation. He said there were also other peoples in Fry's corner involved in setting this up but refused to mention their names. Hall said the decision he made was the wrong one but said he was given an ultimatum and they believed it would be the end of his fighting career if he didn't take a dive. He said Fry also tried to make him feel guilty about costing him the championship at UFC X. In that tournament, Fry, who went into the show somewhat ill, exhausted himself in the first round against Hall in winning, barely hung on but still beat Brian Johnston in the semifinals before losing to a relatively fresh Mark Coleman in the finals, taking a horrific beating in the process. Hall also claimed Fry had promised him 20% of his eventual earnings that night for losing the match and then never paid him. Hall said that Fry had given all he had and suffered a broken hand in the first match with Goodridge. He went on to call Fry overrated, a fake and a fraud as ultimate champion, and said he's dodged fights with Marco Ruiz, Vitor Belfort, and Mark Coleman. Hall mocked Fry's finishing hold saying, "You made me look like an idiot in UU 96 with one of your so-called predator leg locks when you finally got it somewhat in and I did my little acting routine. Most people could see the fight was fixed. I thought you knew how to do a leg lock. You lied to me. I should have rolled up out of it and broke your damn nose like I did in Japan. I broke my ribs 4 weeks before a fight in Japan. But I kept that quiet and still showed up to fight. I still wore your butt out and even broke your nose. It was hard to train and get in proper condition because of my ribs. If I would have been in better condition, I think I would have beaten you in Japan." He then issued his own weird challenge. "I can't even dignify those remarks with a reply," Fry said in response. "Look at the tape of the fight. It speaks for itself. I had fought him and beaten him 2 other times. Why didn't I just pay off Gary Goodridge?" Fry claims that since the ultimate, Hall came to Arizona to train with him for a match in Brazil but left after 2 or 3 days complaining about the heat and, after getting food poisoning from a restaurant sandwich, started blaming him for the weather and the sandwich. Hall claimed Fry brought him out to Arizona and was going to pay him his cut for taking the dive, but after a few days Fry told him money was tight and he had a big tax bill coming and didn't pay him, and Hall left furious. Later Fry did a seminar for Hall in California, and before the seminar, Hall asked to borrow $800 for advertising. Fry said he sent it to him under the guise he'd be given it back from the money from the seminar. The seminar was a financial flop and Fry said he left so badly for Hall, who lives in his gym, that he didn't ask him for his $800 and just wrote it, and the money he spent to travel to the seminar and for his hotel, off his business losses. The fighting world, and for that matter, any one-on-one sport, is subject to potential strange goings-on. There are works, like pro wrestling, Then there are things like sumo, pancrase, K1 and rings, which can be a weird mixture of shooting and working, and even shooting but with professional agreements made ahead of time about what won't be done, even though those agreements could affect the outcome. Tanking matches is commonplace in tennis, but it's not considered a worked sport. Fixed matches in boxing, usually with the fix known to only the promoter and the guy taking the dive, often the winner of the fight doesn't even know he didn't win legitimately, are more common than most people realize, although less common than most within the pro wrestling industry believe. There are matches fixed by the promoters, but there can also be fixed matches where the competitors themselves make a deal unbeknownst to the promoters, which, if Hall's charges are true, this would fall into the category of. However, these charges are very serious when it comes to UFC. Not as serious when it comes to its future, because its future depends more on cable companies than any internal problems with the event's credibility. But even though UFC has a crossover audience with pro wrestling, and UFC competitors on a weekly basis drift into pro wrestling, UFC is not traditional style pro wrestling, and thus its credibility has to be well protected. In addition, the fact is, news travels very fast these days, and UFC has numerous enemies inside and outside the martial arts world, who would love to attack them for looking the other way when someone claimed one of their fights, one that in a large part affected the outcome of their biggest tournament of the year, was fixed. To an extent, many in UFC recognize this, and they have become very leery of booking two fighters in any tournament from the same team or with the same manager, stemming from the suspicions coming out of Ultimate with so many fighters managed by Robert de Persia, Verlins, Fry, Hall, Goodridge, and Johnston. However, Semaphore Entertainment Group needs to look at this situation rather than ignore it, because the credibility of its biggest show of 1996 is now in question. Hall's future with the group has to be done, because either he fixed a fight, which should be grounds for never being brought back, or he lied in public and claimed his loss was a fix, which should also be grounds. However, if Hall's statements are true, and his description went into a lot of detail, then Fry also can't be brought back, and more importantly, questions need to be asked about who these other parties were that Hall was talking about involved in pressuring him, and they also have to be expelled from having any part in the promotion. At this point, it is still one person's word against another, but an investigation needs to be done to find out if there is validity to the story, and if that's the case, the whole story needs to be brought to light and all the parties involved can't be part of UFC any longer. Under the cloud of the death of Pillman, WWF ran its Bad Blood pay-per-view show on October 5th in St. Louis at the Kiel Center. The show drew a legitimate sellout of 21,151 fans, 17,404 paying $212,550, $101,155 in merchandise. It would have been the second largest crowd in the long and storied history of St. Louis wrestling, trailing the famous Strangler Lewis vs. Jim Londo's Stadium match in 1934 that drew 35,000. I really can't give a fair assessment of the show. It appeared that none of the matches were any good except the main event, which was a strong candidate for Match of the Year. I'd give the show a thumbs in the middle, but it's hard to really give you any feelings on the show. 1. Kama Mustafa, Charles Wright, and D. Lo Brown, A.C. Connor, and Rocky Maivia, Wayne Johnson, beat the Legion of Doom, Mike Hegstrand and Joe Laurinaitis, in 12-20 in a 3-on-2 handicap match. Ken Shamrock was in St. Louis and planning on wrestling, but he would have been unable to take any bumps due to his lung injury, and no doubt caution was the order of the day, so he was simply pulled from the match. Farouk came to ringside and distracted Animal, so Brown clotheslined him over the top from behind. In the ring, Maivia pinned Hawk after a Uranagi. It appeared to be a better match than it looked on paper. 2. Max Mini and Nova, formerly Mascarada Sagrada and most recently Mr. Lucky, beat Tarantula, formerly Espectrito 2, real name Alejandro Jimenez, and Mosaic, I have no idea who he is, when Max pinned Tarantula in 6:43. Pretty bad. 3. Godwins, Mark Canterbury and Dennis Knight, won the WWF tag titles from Headbangers, Len Ruth and Charles Warrington, in 12-17. Missed spots all over the place, including the finish where the idea was that Mosh was coming off the top with the Hurricane Rana, but Phineas would catch him in midair and turn it into a power bomb for the pin. Exactly what they did was a very loose translation of that description, and looked terrible. Next came an introduction of Gene Kiniski, Jack Briscoe, Harley Race, Dory Funk, Terry Funk, Luthez and Sam Mushnick, along with photos and clippings of their careers and a career highlights package. This was a tremendous segment. 4. Owen Hart won the vacant Intercontinental title from Farouk, Ron Simmons, in 7-12 when Steve Austin hit Farouk with the title belt. The idea is that Austin wanted Hart to win, so he'd get a shot at Hart, which takes place at Survivor Series. Hart looked like he was mentally somewhere else, probably because he was. Another bad match. 5. DOA, Bryan Adams and Bryan and Ron and Don Harris beat Los Boricuas, Miguel Perez and Juan Rivera and Jose Estrada Jr. and Jesus Castillo, in 9-11 when Crush pinned Castillo after a tilt-a-whirl backbreaker. These 8 had only a few minutes lead time to get dressed and put together a match, so they had an excuse. 6. Bret Hart and Davey Boy Smith beat Vader, Leon White, and the Patriot Del Wilkes in 23-13. This was supposed to be a flag match, but for reasons not made clear, the rules were changed just as the match got started and it basically was just a regular match. The flags were on poles in opposite corners, and the rules were you could win by capturing the flag, but there was no climbing the poles at all during the match, which makes me think the poles weren't secure enough and they changed the rules. It was the walking wounded match. Smith's knee was bothering him and it was his first match back. Vader suffered a broken nose and hyperextended elbow in the Japan match with Shamrock and was basically working the match with one arm. Patriot suffered a severe viral infection earlier in the week, severe enough that he collapsed at home due to dehydration and was rushed to the hospital where he had fluids inserted within 4, but still did the match. It wasn't good either, although considering all the circumstances, Vader did a good job and Patriot did a good job just doing the match. Finish saw Hart pin Patriot after reversing a rolling reverse cradle and holding the tights. 7. Shawn Michaels, Michael Hickenbottom pinned Undertaker Mark Calloway in the Hell in the Cell cage match in 29-59. An absolute classic must-see match, probably 5 stars. Michaels did everything, and then even more than everything. He ended up knocking down a cameraman and beating him up. This caused Commissioner Clouseau to open the door, allowing both to leave the cage area. Before that happened, Undertaker sat up after getting a superkick. While fighting outside the ring, Undertaker catapulted Michaels into the cage and Michaels did a major blade job which needed several stitches. In a totally spectacular scene, both wound up climbing to the top of the cage and doing a few spots there. Michaels was holding onto the top of the cage with his hands, Undertaker stomped on the hands and Michaels took a bump through the Spanish-language announcer's table. Finally they both wound up in the cage. After a ref bump, Undertaker used a choke slam off the middle rope and a hard chair shot to the head when the lights went out. Paul Bearer came out with Kane, Glenn Jacobs on stilts, actually with lifts in his boots to make him appear to be 6'10". Kane used a tombstone on Undertaker and Michaels scored the pin. Japanese television rundown. September 20th, New Japan. 1. Riki Choshu and Tatsumi Fujinami and Genichiro Tenryu beat Hiro Saito and Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Great Muta in 8:56. This was the feature match on the final Power Hall in Yokohama show. The thrust of the match was the emotion with Choshu's final match in Yokohama teaming with 2 of his legendary rivals. The match was stiff and the work was solid, but it was missing something, including any heat for the match itself. Finish saw Muta blow the mist accidentally in Tenzan's eyes, and then Tenryu gave Saito a powerbomb and Choshu pinned him after a lariat. The post-match was quite a bit better than the match itself, with Akira Maeda showing up to a big entrance for the first time in a New Japan ring in 10 years, plus Choshu's longtime tag team partner Animal Hamaguchi and his daughter who is the world champion in the heavyweight division in freestyle, along with Tenryu, Fujinami and Antonio Inoki all honoring Choshu. The highlight was definitely Animal Hamaguchi. 1 star. 2. Kensuke Sasaki won the IWGP Heavyweight title from Shinya Hashimoto in 1654. This was similar to Hashimoto's recent title defenses in that the matches are stiff as hell, but not much fancy. In this case, aside from stiff blows, it was mainly mat wrestling. Finish saw Sasaki hit lariat after lariat on Hashimoto before finishing him with a Northern Lights bomb. Disappointing considering the significance of this match, particularly the performance of Sasaki who just can't rise to the level he's being promoted into. 2 1/4 stars. September 27th, New Japan. 1. Shinjiro Otani pinned Koji Kanemoto in 2020 to retain the J Crown. The final 10 minutes aired on television. As you'd expect, there were a lot of nice moves and execution was superb, but the match lacked heat. They tried a really risky psychological idea. Most of the early portion was on the mat working holds, and even though they were well executed for the most part and sold well, the crowd isn't into the juniors doing mat wrestling as much as big moves and near falls. Otani then did his swan dive, springboard dropkick on Kanemoto, which is one of his patented spots, and Kanemoto just stood there not selling it at all, as almost as if to indicate that it's a fake move. Otani's reaction was to go wild on Kanemoto as if he'd lost his temper because Kanemoto exposed his flashy move as fake, violating the cardinal rule of the business. Later Kanemoto did his trademark rolling senton off the top rope and Otani got up the same way, exposing that move. They went back to the submissions and sold those, but they still didn't get a lot of heat. Finally they picked up with the big moves and near falls, with Otani getting the pin with a dragon suplex. It appears the idea they were trying to get over, in a sense sacrificing the credibility of key spots in order to make the match seem like a shoot, didn't seem to work. Still, it was close to an excellent match overall.
3 3/4 stars.
2.
Naoya Ogawa beat Scott Norton in 6:25 with a combination armbar and triangle choke, which Norton went out on. Really sloppy, but Norton's attitude, as opposed to his wrestling, carried it.
Ogawa looked terrible. After the match, Inoki slapped Masahiro Chono in the face. Dud 3. Osamu Kido and Junji Hirata beat Takashi Iizuka and Kazuyuki Fujita when Kido made Fujita submit to the Wakigatami, Fujiwara armbar. Solid work, but nothing special. They were pushing Fujita in the commentary as a Rookie of the Year. 2 stars. 4.
Sasaki and Kazuo Yamazaki beat Chono and NWO Sting in 10:56 in a first round of the tag team tournament match.
Chono didn't do much physically because of his ankle injury, but mentally he's one of the best around, so his brain carried it. Most of the early portion was Chono and Sting working over Sasaki. Yamazaki came in with a hot tag and looked good. While this was going on, Chono hit Sasaki in the knee with a baseball bat.
Sting then got the bat and hit Yamazaki in the head and he bladed, which got a lot of heat because of how sparingly New Japan uses the gimmick.
Sasaki recovered from the knee shot and used a lariat and power strangle submission on Sting. Finish was pretty good. 2 3/4 stars. Puerto Rico.
The WWC Bombasso 97 show in Caguas on September 27 was headlined by Ray Gonzalez beating Golden Boy and unmasking him to reveal Chicky Star, and they did the same basic result on September 28 in San German. The October 3 show in Bayamon was headlined by Gonzalez defending the Universal title against Dutch Mantle. There's a good chance Mantle is going to wind up as Booker here. Wrecking Crew Al Green and Mark Laurinaitis, who worked many years ago in WCW, have come in as a tag team replacing the Freebirds, who have already left.
Terry Gordy had many problems relating to being unable to work during his short stay.
The only thing I know about Michael Hoyt is that he was said to have been a guy who helped Gordy come back.
Lenny LaFawn is definitely Calgary wrestler Len St. Clair, better known as the Japanese wrestler Dr. Luther. Mexico. Mora Promotions advertised a match with El Hijo del Santo vs. Negro Casas on October 3 in Tijuana, which drew 3,400 fans. However, Casas was still selling injuries from his September 17 hair match at Arena Mexico and didn't appear, and was replaced by Psicosis. Psicosis pinned Santo in what was said to have been the best singles match in Tijuana since the February Santo vs. Rey Mysterio Jr. title change. Mysterio Jr. apologized to the fans for not appearing at the last show he was advertised on as part of an agreement with the commission.
Mysterio Jr. never agreed to do the show as it was held while he was out with the injury, but the commission then suspended him for 6 months for the no-show until he agreed to do the apology at this show. Mysterio Jr. was attacked by Pierre Roth Jr. and thrown over the top rope, leading to Rey Mysterio making the save and setting up a 6-man match. AAA had run a show on September 26 in Tijuana with Heavy Metal vs. Sangre Chicana on top but only drew 500 fans. AAA has introduced a new Psicosis, Leon Negro, who they announced had defeated both the original Psicosis and La Parca to win their names, but no such match ever took place and there is a good chance the originals will take legal action because of it. Antonio Pena said he's going to sue Hector Garza for breach of contract for jumping to Azteca. Garza felt he was able to leave despite signing because Pena hadn't lived up to the contract. Pena is also bringing in Mohicano as the new Venom, replacing the one who jumped to Azteca, Loco Valentino as the new Mosco Ditto, and Picudo was asked to debut on October 31 as the new Halloween, although that one isn't a definite. Heavy Metal is said to be close to jumping to EMLL. Vampiro, who has yet to start with EMLL, now looks to be jumping to AAA and become the top babyface. Latin Lover was about to jump to Azteca, but Pena offered him $4,300 per month to stay, which is big money by Mexican standards. Pena also offered La Parca the same figure to jump back, but at this point he's refused. Arena Mexico the week after Santo vs. Casas drew the sellout of 17,100, drew only 800 fans.
October 3rd at Arena Mexico was headlined by Rayo de Jalisco Jr. and Brazo de Plata and Atlantis vs. Cien Caras and Apollo Dantes and Dr. Wagner Jr. The same night Azteca and Cuautitlán was headlined by Conan and Mascara Sagrada and Parca and Tinieblas Jr. vs. Black Magic and Los Villanos, while AAA's big show of the week was September 28th in Pachuca headlined by Octagon and Mascara Sagrada and Frisbee vs. Fuerza Guerrera and Pentagon and Abismo Negro. All Japan. Kenta Kobashi and Johnny Ace won the double tag team titles from Steve Williams and Gary Albright on October 4th in Nagoya before 5,050 fans when Kobashi pinned Albright after a clothesline in 22:36. Apparently Kobashi is really banged up from all the big matches he's had over the past 10 days, and when the doctors examined his leg, they recommended a long period of recuperation which he's apparently ignoring. Also on the Nagoya show they did a 25th anniversary memorial match with Masafuchi and Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Tao beating Giant Baba and Mitsuharu Misawa and Satoru Asako in 21:26. September 21st TV show did a 2.5 rating. New Japan. There is some talk that the November 2nd Fukuoka Dome J Crown title match will be changed from Shinjiro Otani defending against Chris Benoit to Ultimo Dragon challenging. September 20th TV show drew a 3.9 rating. Other Japan notes. There are several shoot angles or maybe not angles going in. The biggest is an angle where Atsushi Onita quit FMW to form a new promotion called Zen that will debut in December. Onita is simply copying Hulk Hogan and Bret Hart in doing a heel turn teaming with Yukihiro Kanemura. Zen will open its own offices but really be FMW promoting major shows attempting to work with WWF, All Japan, New Japan and maybe ECW. Onita held a press conference and announced the Zen promotion would have Hideki Hasaka, Kanemura, Haito and Tetsuhiro Kuroda as its top stars. He also announced he'd worked 3 FMW shows this month. He described himself as the father of FMW, but that FMW is now a grown-up and that Hayabusa and Masato Tanaka need to run it as adults on their own. But he said that the father still has to show he can beat up the children. On October 14th in Sapporo, Onita and Kanemura and Haito will challenge Hayabusa and Tanaka and Koji Nakagawa for the FMW World's 6-man tag titles, while on October 19th in Sendai, Onita and Kanemura challenge Hisakatsu Oya and Mr. Ganasuke for the tag titles and Tanaka defends the heavyweight titles against Hasaka. It also appears Pancrase and Rings may be working together and all the grandstanding was setting the stages for this big angle. Or maybe they are still grandstanding. Pancrase had a press conference on October 4th where Yoshiki Takahashi challenged Akira Maeda to a Vale Tudo match. Takahashi and Pancrase president Masami Ozaki said they would hold the match on neutral grounds, on an All Japan Kickboxing Federation show. Both Pancrase and Rings have a loose affiliation with that group, and suggested dates that group has booked at Korakuen Hall between November and February as possibilities. Takahashi said that if Maeda doesn't respond to the challenge, that he would go to a Rings house show and issue the challenge live. A note from last week. The SRS television producer who had to apologize to Maeda's name is Kunio Kiyohara, the top sports division executive at the Fuji Television Network, which is Japan's #1 network. War will be reviving the old Japanese heavyweight title in a tournament starting November 18th. Genichiro Tenryu and Junzo Hasegawa, who was the promoter of the old JWA, the dominant promotion in Japan during the 50s and 60s, held a press conference. There was talk of putting Tenryu against Naoya Ogawa to determine the first champion, since it would be similar to the most famous match to determine the actual first champion on December 22, 1954, where Rikidozan, a former sumo star like Tenryu, beat Masahiko Kimura, a former judo champion like Ogawa. Here and there. Igor Zinoviev was pulled from the October 11th IWF pay-per-view lineup due to a back injury suffered in training. His place will be taken by Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt Renato Verissimo, a protege of John Lewis and Andre Pederneiras, who faces former NCAA wrestling champion Mike Van Arsdale. Billy Jack Haynes has resurfaced again on the Oregon wrestling scene. Haynes disappeared 7 months ago after doing a series of exposes on the pro wrestling business, with the rumors being that some bad people were on his trail and he was hiding out after accumulating heavy gambling debts. Before he disappeared, he got into a verbal war with Matt Bourne. He returned a few weeks ago apologizing to everyone in wrestling for what he'd done, talked of having gambling problems and apologized for burning people like Bourne, Sandy Barr and Don Owen in the past, saying he didn't want to go out of wrestling as a loser. Haynes and Bourne are now working together as co-hosts on the same radio station. Moondog Moretti has become a member of the Oregon Boxing and Wrestling Commission. He has said as long as he works on the commission, he won't wrestle in the state. Steve Dahl was scheduled to return to Portland Wrestling on October 4th. Apparently in a non-angle, Bourne broke Bart Sawyer's arm on September 23rd after the two had an argument at Bourne's house that escalated into a fight. Top matches on Steve Nelson's USWF show on October 18th in Amarillo, Texas are Nelson defending the middleweight title against Taichi Hayashi, Paul Jones defending the light heavyweight title against Tony Castillo, Lisa Hunt defending the women's light heavyweight title against Eva Van Divier, a match to determine their first heavyweight champion between Heath Herring versus Evan Tanner, and a match to determine their first lightweight champion with Michael Buell versus Diego Akota. Becky Levy debuts on the show against Leslie Brace. October 18th in Roselle Park, New Jersey at the high school has Tito Santana versus Demolition Axe and Sergeant Slaughter versus Nikolai Volkov plus Salvatore Sincere, Ace Darling, Devon Storm, and Cousin Luke. Leigh Roberts, a star in Australia in the mid-70s who happened to wrestle in the very first live match that I ever saw some 27 years ago, passed away I believe this past week from an automobile accident. Roberts wrestled in California in the early 70s under his real name and also as Dingo the Sundowner. He was a mid-card wrestler in Australia after returning home, coming to the ring on a motorcycle. As it turned out, the October 4th roller derby game at Keyser Pavilion in San Francisco to be Ann Calvello's retirement never took place because nobody paid for the building and there was too much infighting among the people putting it on. On October 17th in Billerica, Massachusetts there will be a birthday show for Killer Kowalski, who should be right around 70, featuring Hunter Hearst Helmsley, a protege versus Scott Taylor and George Steele versus Vince Apollo. If any experienced wrestlers want to do the show in the area they can call promoter Wendell Weatherby at 508-671-9271. NHB. The riot in the Renzo Gracie vs. Eugenio Tadeo match in Rio de Janeiro wound up making a ton of publicity in the US, including airing on CNN and on numerous sports shows, which only gives UFC another black eye, and most of the reports called it ultimate fighting. In addition, the Secretary of Sports in Rio stemming from the riot banned Vale Tudo matches from Rio de Janeiro, although most think it'll end up being a temporary ban. There were strong rumors at press time that Carlao Barreto had suffered an ankle injury in training for UFC, but at this point he's still listed for the show. UFC has added a few new rules to make them more cable-friendly: no head-butting and no elbows to the throat or to the back of the neck. At this point the rule changes are starting to become controversial. However, even with the new changes there is no movement within the cable industry. It's virtually a lock that the replacement for Dan Severn, if he were to be injured at the Tokyo Dome for the title shot at Maurice Smith, would be Tank Abbott. UFC will be broadcast on the internet for $20. Guy Mesger is promoting a show on October 24th in Dallas with Frank Shamrock vs. Wes Gassaway, Trey Telligman vs. Dan Flores, Mesger vs. Paul Lesenby, and Brian Gassaway vs. Vernon White. ECW. Taz agreed to stay with ECW through the end of 1998 after a few conversations this past week with Eric Bischoff. Taz's deal with ECW expired at the end of this year and he and Paul Heyman were apart on a deal for next year. Taz had 2 conversations in midweek with Bischoff, but no dealings with the WWF since he'd talked with them in the past and didn't like how the dealings went. After Bischoff's initial offer to Taz, he verbally agreed to Heyman's deal for 1998. Bischoff came back with a much better offer the next day that was said to have been very tempting, but after consulting with his family and weighing the difference between working 100 or so dates per year, mostly within driving distance, and close to 200 dates, few of which would be within driving distance, he decided to stay put. Bischoff on an America Online chat denied ever talking to Taz. I have no idea why. October 17th in Downingtown, Pennsylvania has a 3-way dance for the title with Douglas, Sabu, and Dreamer, plus Furnace and LaFon versus Bigelow and Condito, Dudley's versus Rotten and Mahoney, and Sasuke versus Lynn. The only house show of the week was a sold show on October 3rd in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, before about 300 fans, with the same New Jack and Cronus winning a 3-way dance over the Dudleys and Rotten and Mahoney. They are doing a new gimmick where Chris Condito is accompanied by Francine to the ring, and they say that if Condito doesn't beat Chris Chetty, that Francine will show her new surgically enhanced boobs to the crowd. Of course, Condito won the match. WCW. Jeff Jarrett's contract expired on October 7th. He was offered $300,000 per year to stay but turned it down, and the general feeling is that he's gone. Jerry Jarrett, who is handling his negotiations, smartly used media avenues to play up the contract expiring and get the word out he was negotiating with Titan to play all the leverage. He was still being advertised on Nitro, and they even did an angle to build up a match with Steve McMichael where if Steve won, Deborah would have to get out of the wrestling business, even though he wasn't signed nor had he agreed to work the show without a contract.
Nitro on October 6th at the Target Center in Minneapolis drew 11,940, paying $206,083.
It was one of the best Nitros in a long time. Hogan and Bischoff opened with an interview where Hogan plugged his movie Assault on Devil's Island that will be on TNT on October 28th, and actually has gotten some decent reviews, and vowed to confront Piper later in the show. Booker T pinned Jarrett in 9:06 due to interference from Steve McMichael in a good match. Alex Wright pinned Billy Kidman in 6:04 with a German suplex in another good match. Ernest Miller pinned Mortis with a high kick off the ropes in 5:31.
Scott Hall pinned Hector Garza in 1:53 with the Edge in a match where he mockingly faked a back injury as a spoof since everyone figured he was faking his injury the past 2 weeks anyway.
He didn't give Garza any offense. After the match he spray-painted Z on the ref, who was made to act like a total scared rabbit. Page beat Disco Inferno via DQ in 4:02 when Savage interfered. Savage attempted to piledriver Page on the floor, but Piper made the save and Page ended up giving Savage a diamond cutter on the floor. Savage sold it huge and did an injury stretcher angle as the rest of the NWO vowed revenge on Page. Piper did an interview announcing that if Hall and Nash didn't defend the belts next week on Nitro that they'd be stripped of them. Hogan confronted Piper along with Bischoff and Piper ended up being attacked, but made his own comeback until the NWO dragged Hogan out of the ring. Mike Tenay's Mexican Wrestling History segment aired and it was really good, particularly in trying to condense 64 years of history into 3 minutes. Eddie Guerrero pinned Dragon with the headbutt off the top in 6:06 of a match that was better than average but still not what these two are capable of to keep the cruiser title. Main event saw Hennig pin Benoit in a U.S. title match with a Fisherman suplex in 7:53. An outstanding match with Hennig looking the best he has in probably 6 or 7 years, and Benoit was typical Benoit. After the match the NWO destroyed Benoit until Flair with his new face made the save and chased Hennig out of the building and did another classic interview with a lot of shoot comments talking about how people had been trying to get him out of the promotion for 10 years and he was still there. Flair's return got an incredible reaction and this was probably the best finish of a Nitro show in history and he said he'd be wrestling Hennig at the pay-per-view. Dark matches on the show saw Kevin, formerly Nails, Kelly beat Yuji Nagata in a match described as off the charts horrible. Local wrestler Jamie Majum, who wrestles as Jamie Magnum, pinned Lenny Lane, and after Nitro ended they had one more dark match where Barry Darsow and John Knorr beat Wayne Bloom and Mike Enos. Nitro drew a 3.91 rating, 4.18 first hour, 3.70 seconds hour, and 6.02 share. Raw, largely due to the curiosity factor stemming from the Pillman death, drew a 3.00 rating, 2.85 first hour, 3.15 seconds hour, and 4.59 share. The Nitro replay did a 1.64 rating and 3.01 share. In the head-to-head 5 segments, Nitro did a 3.70 to Raw's 2.86. Nitro opened huge at a 4.1 for the Hogan and Bischoff interview. The peak rating was actually in the 3rd segment rather than the traditional 4th, which was the Wright vs. Kidman match at a 4.3, although the Mortis vs. Miller match basically held the rating. Head-to-head, WWF won a quarter for the first time in months with a 3.3, Pillman salute. Without question the curiosity about Pillman drew the strong WWF Open, plus Michaels and Helmsley first segment, to 3.2, Hall vs. Garza. In 2 weeks we're going to have a complete analysis of all the top performers and the ratings they draw and you'll literally be amazed at how Hall fares. Other head-to-heads saw a Nitro 3.7, Page vs. Disco and post-match angle, to Raw 2.8, Michaels and Hart argument plus Godwins vs. Bangers, a Nitro 4.2, Piper interview and Hogan confrontation, to Raw 2.7, Mero vs. Perez and Cornette interview, a Nitro 3.7, Tenay Mexico feature and Guerrero vs. Dragon, to Raw 2.6, Maivia vs. Bulldog, and a Nitro 3.7, Hennig vs. Benoit and a Flair save and interview, to Raw 2.9, Austin interview with McMahon and Nation of Domination on the Wall. The Raw peak rating was a 3.4 for the Melanie Pillman interview, the Brian Pillman feature and the debut of Kane. The other weekend numbers saw a main event at 1.3, Saturday night at 1.9 and Pro at 1.6. Both Hennig and Malenko were back in action from injuries by the weekend house shows.
October 4th in Duluth, Minnesota drew 2,732 paying $45,630 and October 5th in Mankato, Minnesota drew 2,792 paying $46,395.
The expectation is that the Hiac pay-per-view will do around a $315,000 house, which would be the largest in WCW history. Among the names scheduled for the Universal Studio Worldwide tapings are Black Cat, Perry Saturn, who was on Nitro at ringside with Raven, Teddy Long, Mr. Aguila from Mexico, who is the hottest teenage high flyer in the country, Black Magic from Florida, Doc Dean from England, or Tsubasa,
a Japanese jobber trained in Mexico by Dragon, Greg Valentine, Hiroyoshi Tenzan, Aztec Warrior, Black Warrior from Promo Azteca, Bobby Blaze, Mike Anthony, Mike Lazanki, currently working Puerto Rico, Robbie Brookside, British wrestler currently working Austria, Sumo Fuji, probably another Dragon trainee,
Belfast Bruiser, Chad Fortune, Jim Duggan, Horace Boulder, Barry Darso, Frankie Lancaster, Luis Piccoli, Super Astro, Tokyo Magnum, probably another Dragon trainee, Mike Rapata, Colorado Kid, Barry Horowitz, Chris Adams, Gorgeous George, Rob Kellum, Super Crazy from Mexico, El Texano from Mexico,
Dandy from Mexico, Alex Porto and David, Vampire Warrior, Heath.
The big names, being Page, Steve McMichael, Elizabeth, Giant, Luger, Nash, All, Flair and Savage only work on October 15th. Hall appeared at the weekend house shows but this time was in a wheelchair and didn't work, so Six worked the main event against Luger. There was some talk about not doing the Jacqueline vs. Disco match on the pay-per-view, but it was announced on Monday after it was cleared by the Nevada State Athletic Commission after WCW and the commission agreed to certain stipulations which I believe will end up with it not really being a match. TV was taped on October 1st in Belton, Georgia before a sellout 1,300 paying $10,000. Belfast Bruiser debuted beating David Taylor. They had an upset with Kidman beating Right clean and it appeared Raven and Richards were scouting Kidman for their group. Mike Rapata, Colorado Kid, won a squash. Raven beat Mark Starr in a squash. They did the gimmick where Raven hadn't signed his contract and demanded that all his matches be no DQs, so he can use gimmicks and he used a chair in this one.
Benoit beat Hennig via DQ when Norton and Conan interfered. In the match Hennig suffered a bloody nose and a wrist injury, although he didn't miss any bookings. Jimmy Hart was back in Meng's corner and they teased a reformation of the Dungeon of Doom. Luger beat Norton in next week's TV main event. It was announced that on January 5th, Nitro will be from the new Georgia Dome in Atlanta.
Terry Taylor missed Nitro this week due to his father being very ill, so Sullivan handled most of the booking himself.
There was some internal heat because Hall and Nash didn't do television angles to explain their injuries as everyone else has done.
WWF Raw taping on October 6th in Kansas City, Missouri drew a sellout 13,245, 11,484 paying $185,000, all figures being all-time records for the city.
The show opened with the 10-bell salute to Pillman.
Michaels and Helmsley did an interview where Michaels said he was the real icon of wrestling and unlike the other icons, he wasn't a fossil. They showed the famous click curtain call from MSG where Michaels, Helmsley, Ramon and Diesel broke kayfabe and hugged and made fun of McMahon for what they did. They came back and Brett came out, mainly to challenge Helmsley, although it wound up with shoot comments flying back and forth. Brett called Michaels and Helmsley homos and said he made more money than all three of them combined.
Michaels claimed he was the real star because he only has to wrestle once a month, or at least once a week tops, while Brett is out there every night, and that while Brett needs wrestling, wrestling needs Shawn and Triple H. Brett said that until Michaels has the belt that he'll never be the showstopper, and made reference to the two guys, one being Chyna, in the ring with him. He claimed to have run out Diesel and Razor and called them Shawn's boyfriends. Michaels said in reference to them leaving not to confuse expansion with destruction. Anyway, it was all fascinating television, but then they had to start wrestling. Headbangers beat Godwins in a non-title lumberjack match in 4:06 when half the promotion interfered and Mosh ended up pinning Henry with a schoolboy. Mark Marrow debuted and with his new look of a short crew cut doing a boxer gimmick destroyed all of what was left of his charisma, and then beat Miguel Perez with a diamond cutter in 2:22. Cornette did a taped feature almost word for word his America Online interview that was printed here ripping on the NWO and Bischoff. I got a few laughs out of it but can't see the purpose of it. McMahon wants to have a harder-edged product where he publicly comes out swinging against the competition, and the plan is for Cornette to do weekly interviews of this type. Smith pinned Maivia with a power slam in 3:44.
Austin did an interview with McMahon where McMahon gave him the 3 options and Austin agreed to sign a release, but not until McMahon at the same moment gave him a contract for an Intercontinental title match against Owen Hart. Nation of Domination came on the wall and Austin and Farouk argued over Austin, costing Farouk the match with Owen. Owen beat Hawk in 3:22 when Henry Godwin hit Hawk with a horseshoe in a bad match. Then came the Pillman segment. The timing of the Melanie thing just seemed a week too early, although the video afterwards was nice. Kane came out and the gimmick looked impressive and seemed to get over. Finally, Helmsley beat Brett via countout when Shawn used a super kick on Brett at 10:45. Match was below average. Shamrock's injuries were both a lung infection and a bruised lung and is expected to be back in the ring for the California house shows this coming weekend. Ahmed Johnson will be out 2 to 4 weeks after surgery on his hand. Steve Austin met with Dr. Joseph Torg in Philadelphia on October 7 for final clearance for his scheduled return on October 18. Weekend house shows saw October 3 in Winnipeg draw 7,815 and 141,400.